Hey guys, in today's video we are gonna talk about notes and what notes are, how they work, and why they are so great for color grading compared to something like in Premiere Pro where you have Lumetri Color, which is, in my humble opinion, shit. Sorry about that, but it is. You can still do fine color grading in Premiere Pro and Lumetri Color, and you can probably do the same in Final Cut Pro as well with something similar, but to be honest, notes in Davinci it's been such a game changer for me, and it's so great for color grading. So if you've seen my previous videos on Let's Color Grade, you've probably already seen notes, and they might seem a little bit frightening in the beginning. It's a different way of looking at it, but we'll go through it step by step. We'll talk about what the different notes are, at least the basic ones, and how they work. We're gonna talk about how they kind of match and mix into what our common understanding of layers are, if you've done some video editing before. And don't worry, if you don't know what nodes are at all, we'll go through the very basics in the beginning and take you through it all, and I'll show you my kind of basic workflow on how I do color grading as well, and why it makes so much sense to do it in notes and split up the color grading process as you go through it. So without much further ado, let's just jump straight into Davinci on the computer and get started. We are inside of Davinci now, and we've jumped straight into the color grading tab, as that's where we will be working today. And as you see, when you open the color tab for the first time, you have one node already. So this is a node. It says 01 on this one already because it's our first node. And right now when we hover above it, it says no color correction because we haven't done anything at all. On the left, we have our image. This is our log image from my Canon R6. It's shot in C-Log3. Let's just first, before we do anything, talk about what a node is. So a node is basically where all your controls for your color grading lives. It's where we do all our adjustments. And if you color graded in Final Cut Pro or in Premiere Pro before, this is kind of similar to Lumetri Color and whatever they have in Final Cut Pro as well. Similar to other tools where you can video edit as well. You have all these controls where you can do like curves, and you can do, usually you have the log wheels with shadows, midtones, and highlights. All this stuff is what lives inside of this. And if you worked in Premiere Pro before, as I have, Lumetri Color is kind of similar. One Lumetri Color is kind of similar to one node, and where it gets super useful to have these nodes, you'll see in just a minute when I show you why you need to split, or why you should split your color grading into different nodes and how they work together and how that's such a great workflow. So the first thing I'm gonna do here is tell you what kind of node this is. So this is just a simple serial node right now. It lives on its own. It has two green dots here, or an arrow and a square, and the same thing with the blue. The blue ones we won't touch today. These are the keyings, and you can do some more advanced stuff with these along the lines. But for our simple understanding of what a node is, you don't really need to understand what the blue ones does for this quick tutorial. So the green ones is the input. This is what goes into our node, and the green square here is what goes out of our node. And right now it's fixed into our timeline. So this is our input and this is our output. So these needs to be combined all the way through for our signal to go through and our color grade to go through to our clip. So the first thing I want to do is create another serial node. And I'll drag that all the way to the right. And that's because I want it to be converting our log image to Rec. 709. So I'm going to apply a transform tool here to grade it from log to Rec. 709. And if you haven't shot in log, this doesn't really apply that much to you. But the gamma input, or the gamut, is Canon Cinema Gamut. That's what I've shot in. And it's shot in Canon Log 3. So that's what we're going to select. Then we're going to transform it into Rec. 709. And we are going to make gamma 2.4 our gamma. So you can see essentially it's just made it from a less flat image into something that our display understands. I'll make a video very soon on the basics of color management and what all of this means. So if you haven't shot in log, just know that this is the basics, and this doesn't really have anything to do with the node in particular. But what we need to understand now is that we have two nodes, and these are, as I said before, serial nodes. So we click add node, and then we added a serial node. We have these different nodes. So we have serial, we can add one after and one before. Then we have parallel nodes, layer nodes, and outside nodes. And these are the ones that we will go through today, but let's just start with the basics and start with our serial nodes. So right now we have two nodes. We have the one that transforms our image, and then we have one node that right now does nothing. So if I click Command D, that disables it and it enables it again. And you can see nothing happens. If we do the same on our second node, you'll see that it turns off the conversion that we did and turns it on again. So right now, these two nodes are combined, but nothing happens in node 1. So let's add another serial node and just not care about what's now node 3 over here. This is our conversion, so let's just focus on what's going on in node 1 and 2. Now, if I was going to start grading this image, I would probably start with creating some contrast. So I would just go into our custom curves and make a simple S-curve here, like so, to create some contrast in our image. Now, what's going on now is that this node inherits whatever is going on in node 1. So you can kind of see them as layers. So if we put them on top of each other, we can even add another one, node 3. These work as our layers. This is how you understand it in common editing tools that are node based. This is kind of like our bottom layer, our second layer, and our third layer. So if now we wanted to adjust the exposure, we can go to our primary wheels and we can just drag down the offset a little bit to kind of balance in the image and make sure that the exposure is correct, that everything lies more or less where we want it inside of our scope down here. So what happens here is that whatever happened in node 1 will now be taken into node 2. So if I turn this off, you can see that these two are now the same. And also on node 3, nothing happens. If we turn off node 4, now we don't have our conversion, but we still have our exposure changes going on. If I turn on node 2 again, this still happens. So everything that happens down here will continue into the next node. That's why they are serial nodes. Let's just turn on everything again. And the way you can really see how this works is that if we were to say, okay, let's take node 3 and node 4. By the way, I just clicked Option S to add another serial node. It's the same thing as right-clicking and adding a serial node, okay? So if we take node 3 and we say, okay, let's put saturation to 0. That means our image is basically black and white. There's no colors left. Now, if we go into node 4, you can see saturation is back to 50, which is the starting point. But if I turn it up now, nothing really happens because we don't have any colors in our image at all. That's because we took out all the colors in node 3, and everything that happens after that is taking the output from node 3 and everything that happened before, putting it into the next node, and that's what we're working with now. So we don't have any color left. We can't really go into our curves in here and say, okay, I want the green point to be changing, nothing happens. And you can see there's no graph down here either because we don't have any color left inside of our node. So basically right now from node 3 and onwards, we only have black and white to work with. We could still go into our custom curves and add more contrast, that will still work, but we don't have any colors to work with. So just to understand how serial nodes work, the previous node, everything is taken from that and what happened prior to that, putting into the next node, and then that's what we're working with. So that kind of goes into how you're stacking together your edit and kind of the progress of how you want to do things as well. So let's just reset node 3 again, and now we're back to our starting point. So understanding serial node is quite easy. You can see them as layers. So layer 1, well, the bottom layer, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4. We're just building on top of that. But just understanding that if we take away something, it will not be there in the next one. But the great thing about nodes now are that because we just did our desaturation here, we can go back in and change that. So now we have no saturation left again. And if we go to node 4 and we say, okay, I want to add some yellow into the midtones, I can do that. And you can see that we slightly have some yellow tones coming in. But if I then go in and say, okay, I actually want my saturation back now, or even more saturation. So let's crank it up to 100. Not that looks nice. But because I have put it into nodes, I can go in and individually control everything that's going on. So I can also go in and adjust our curve here, say, okay, I want some more contrast. I can do that. And you could put everything into one node. So let's just remove these nodes again and say, okay, so this is now the node that I want to desaturate. Put it down to 25. We only have half the colors that we had before now. And we can even go in and disable this one and say, okay, let's just crank down our offset here. And now we basically have the same image as before. Even if we go and put the saturation back, these two nodes are doing the exact same as what we did before with the offset. But now if I turn this off, you will go back to only having the Rec 709 conversion that we did over here, but nothing else going on. And going in to adjust this is going to be kind of confusing. You can see that when we hover above it, we've done something with primary offset and we've done something with custom curves. And we have the small dots up here showing what we've done. But if we keep stacking on top of this, we'll just keep adding more stuff. And when we disable it and try to figure out what's going on, we can't really see what's happening. So the great way of doing this is to build them as kind of layers and feeding into each other. And that way controlling what you're doing, and you have an easier time going back and nitpicking what you're doing, okay? So that's where serial nodes come in handy. And you could say, okay, I could just stack Lumetri color inside of Premiere Pro and that would be the same. And yes, in theory, that would be the exact same. So why are nodes then so powerful, and why am I talking about them like it's some crazy cool shit that you all need to know? Now, just deleted node 4, and now let me show you another node. So remember in the beginning, we talked about having these different nodes. Now we've covered serial nodes and how they work. They feed into each other and then feed into the next one, and they inherit whatever happened prior to that node, okay? Now let's add a parallel node. This node goes underneath the first node. And what's so cool about the parallel nodes is that they are both feeding the input from node 2. So whatever happened up until node 2 here, our exposure change in the offset and our exposure, or like our contrast in the custom curve, that has happened here. But now both of these are fed from that. So that means if we change something inside of node 3, it doesn't change that in node 4, or at least the input that node 4 has not been changed. Let me give you an example of why that's great. So let's just delete this node again. So let's just add another node again, go back to this structure and then say, okay, for node 4, I want to select in our qualifier, I want to select all the darkest parts in here. So let's just drag down our luminance, click Shift H to see what we're doing. Right now we're not selecting anything. Drag it up, and now you can see, okay, now we have the darkest part. We could just soften it out. And okay, so now we kind of have selected the darkest parts of our image, including our subject here. That's great. Now I want to go in, click Shift H again to see what we're doing. And now I want to make all of these shadows blue. Not that that makes much sense, but let's just turn down the temperature and see what's happening. Okay, minus 3000, just to make it simple. This is what's going on now. So node 4 now is changing all the shadows. It's not changing the highlights, it's changing all the shadows. And we could even go back and say, okay, we want a little bit less. So now it's only like the darkest parts of our image. But now if we go back to node 3 and say, okay, I want to go back to our primary wheels here and then just increase the lift. And look what happens now. Now nothing is turned blue, or at least it's very, very little that's turned blue. So if we go out to a selection here and click Shift H, we'll see that we almost have nothing selected now. And that's because node 3 feeds into node 4. So what we selected before was the darkest parts, but those parts are not the darkest anymore because now we've brightened that up in node 3 and that changes everything. So that's where parallel nodes come in very handy. So let's just reset or delete these two again, create a new serial node here, and then create a parallel node underneath it. Let's try and do the same thing. So for this node, we will go in and, or let's say node 4, we'll go in and take the darkest parts again, click up the softening, and then just drag it up until we have something that we like, something like this. That's something that we had before. Let's say we want to go maybe not as extreme this time, but let's go minus 1000 just to cool it down. You can see the changes that we've done here. But now, if we go in to node 3 now and say, okay, we want to do the same thing. We want to lift up the colors here. Maybe not as extreme, but like so. You can actually see that we still have made all the parts blue, or cool them down as we're doing with the temperature as we did before. Because what we are selecting in node 4 down here hasn't changed at all. These are still the exact same things that we had selected, but now we're also brightening it up in node 3, but we're keeping that blue or that cooled tint that we made to the darkest parts of the image, because what we're doing to both nodes are feeding from node 2. So that's where nodes come in, and they're really, really strong because we can put things on top of each other like this. And it doesn't really work as layers per se with these parallel nodes because they're mixing things together. So you can see how that's mixed together, that we both brightened it up and we've made the blue. That's really, really strong. You can see that this is a parallel mixer. So as you remember, we had layer nodes. So this is the second one. And actually, it'll do the same thing. It'll just make another node underneath the first one and then feed the inputs from the previous nodes, which are node 2 in this case. But we can also click on this one and just morph it into a layer mixer node, which is essentially doing the same thing. And an interesting thing happened here, that now we have actually only brightened up the darker parts, not as much as we did before, because now the layers are being put together. And a way to show that is if we go back and say, okay, let's just stop this. Say, okay, now we haven't brightened up this part. We still have our second node. Everything in the darkest parts are blue. But now I want to warm up the image. You can see if we warm it up to 1000, it's only more or less these parts here that are being brightened up, and not everything going on in node 4. If I turn off node 4, you can see that everything is now being warmed up by the temperature. But if I turn it on, all the parts that we selected that are the darkest parts, and because we kind of soften it out, we can just remove the softening again. Now you can really see what's going on, right? So because we don't have the softening, there's no blending going on at all. Whatever we're saying here is that this is the bottom layer. This is a little bit confusing, so let's just cover that real quick. You can see this feeds into the first input. This feeds into the second input. And contrary to what we just talked about before and what layers normally are and how they understand, the bottom layer is usually the bottom layer. Inside of these layer nodes is actually opposite. So the top layer is the bottom layer, and then so forth, the bottom layer will be the top layer. It's a little bit confusing, but just remember that and you'll be fine. Honestly, I don't use the layer nodes that often, but they can be quite handy if you want to split something. If you want to isolate the subject, do something to the background, this could be a very great way to do it, because then you will make sure that nothing happens to the subject at all, only whatever you're doing here, and then whatever's going on the layer beneath will not affect the subject. So you can see now that we didn't soften anything on our luminance selection here. What's going on is that all the darkest parts are just turned blue, and it kind of overrides whatever's going on in node 3. So that doesn't impact this node at all, but we still mix them together in the sense that whatever happens in node 3 is fed in here, and what happens in node 4 is put on top and not affected by node 3. But if we had done it in the serial way, we can actually quickly just show that. If we turn off these nodes, add node, add serial node, just put this one aside, add another serial node, and I can copy from node 3 to node 6, turn it on. You can see that's the exact same thing as node 3 did before, just warming it up by 1000, then taking node 4, putting it onto node 7 and turning it on. Now you can see that they're blending together. But what's going on now is that it's taking the already warmed up image from node 6 and then applying the darkest parts, which are still our selection because we haven't changed any luminance, we've only changed the temperature, and then applying the coolness on top of that, kind of putting it back to 0. And it was not feeding from 0, it was just going back. So that's still where the layers can be very strong. So let's just delete these two again, select these and click Command D. Now we're back to this. So that's how the layers are understood and work. And if we switch this back to, select this and switch it back to a parallel node, now we can see that they mix together. And it very, very much looks like exactly what we did before with the serial nodes, but they're just feeding from this one. So they're mixing it together in the same way, cooling it, warming it up and cooling it down, and kind of like where they meet in the middle is where it's just normal. So you can see that these parts are being more blue, this is kind of neutral, and then everything that's not been touched by the darkest parts are being warmed up. So we're splitting the image that way, and that's fine. This is not really usually the ideal case of using it. The ideal case would usually be something like, okay, let's say we want to warm up the right side. So let's make a power window and make this feather it out. Say that, okay, our right side of our image is more warm. So let's do something like that. And then do the same thing here, maybe do a squared mask and say, okay, we want our left side to be cooler, feather that out, and then do like that. So that's where it really makes sense to start using the parallel nodes. And these are just blending very well together now because it's a parallel mixer. So now we've just basically cooled down this side and warmed up this side, and that's the only thing that's going on. But both are feeding from this, mixing it together, and then feeding it onto the next step in the line, which is really great. So the last node that we're actually missing here is the outside node. So if we select this on our node here, you can see that if we click Shift H, the only thing we have selected here, and also because we've only selected the darkest part, so let's just remove that for a second. Now we only have like the left side because we blended it in. Remember, like this, we just feather it in. We can feather it in a little bit more. And this is the only parts we've selected. So this is now being cooled down. But what the outside node does now, it's connected with the blue string, which is the keying, which we're not going to go into in this. But just to know what it does in this particular instance, it takes whatever we keyed in here and masked. And so we can look at the key here and you can see this is our gradient. This is what we've selected. This one is doing the complete opposite. So you can see it fades here and it's selected everything on the right. But what we can use this node for now, so let's turn off node 3 for a second and say, okay, now we have node 4 is selecting this part and cooling it down. And for the example's sake of what we're doing, let's just warm up the right part. So now that was only by 100. We want to do 1000 to see the effect. Now you can see that this node, node 6, is doing the opposite of node 4, or selecting the opposite. And now that we warmed it up, it selected everything here. But what's cool about this is if we go into this mask and say, okay, we want to push it a little bit further ahead, you can see that it changes the output or the input for node 6 immediately as well. So now that only selects this part. And if we go back, put it even further, now you see that now we even made it to the edge over here. So let's just drag that in. Now you can see now we split the image kind of in half, but we're only doing it with this one. So outside nodes are a really great way and strong way to kind of say, okay, I've selected this. Now I want to select everything else. Let's just do one more quick way of showing what you can do with those. So now we've reset both of these nodes. This is still an outside node. So just to say we want to make a vignette kind of feel for this particular image. Feather it out quite a bit. Say, okay, this might look good. We want to increase the gamma in here. So I just want to increase the look here, the gain a little bit as well, just brightening up this part, making it look a little bit nicer maybe. And then we go into this one and say, okay, I just want to do the opposite here. I just want to kind of make a vignette. And kind of the more extreme I go, the more you can see what we're actually doing here. You can see we're creating this kind of vignette because we're selecting everything that's not being selected in the first one. So as we control this as well, this effect on the second one will be less as well. And what we've essentially done is just kind of brighten up the middle and make the corners darker. Okay, so that's essentially the different nodes that you can use in here. But for simple purposes and simple use, let's just delete these. The serial nodes are a great way to start, and the things that I use the most often are these nodes. So this will be the structure. If you have log, converting that in the end, we'll make a separate video on why you need to, or why you want to convert it as the last thing. That's to do with color space and color management. But leaving that aside, we have the contrast, we have our exposure. Now we can start doing our creative editing or our creative color grading. So let's just do something very simple. Maybe take the blues in here and turn them a little bit more teal. Take the warmer tones here and turn them a little bit more warm. And kind of like stylizing our look a little bit here. Maybe even taking the luminance, doing the same thing. Just make these dots here and say, okay, we want to darken the border. I'll brighten up these parts here. And kind of, it's very subtle. We've done a very subtle change here. but that could be a way of using the serial nodes. So now we have our structure of like color correcting or correcting our image first, then putting some creative power onto it. We can even go a little bit further. So let's create another serial node, maybe put them below each other. So now we have a structure that says, this is our correction, this is our grading. Just pull in a little bit more teal into our darker areas, and then pull in some more warmth in our brighter parts or in our gamma, maybe even a little bit in our brightest parts with the gain as well. Not that this looks particularly good, I will admit that, but just dialing it in a little bit here. We could do a lot more work for this tutorial. That's not really necessary. It's not the best look, but this is what we could be doing. Then we could be adding another serial node and say, okay, now we want to do some masking. So let's just do a few parallel nodes here and then do the same thing as kind of what we did before. We want to create some more light or brightness over here. So just feathering this in, pulling up the gamma, pulling up the gain, creating some more brightness up here, maybe emulating that there's kind of like a sun here, and then doing the same thing opposite with a squared mask over here, pulling this down, feathering it in, pulling it over to the side, clicking Shift H to see what we're doing, and then we can just like kind of darken this part down a little bit, maybe even go into our curves and drag up the black point just to make sure we're not losing too much detail. And now you can see very quickly we've just kind of controlled the light as well. We're feeding both node 5 and node 6 from node 4, and thereby just selecting what's going on in the image. Now we're making masks, so we're not really selecting anything in particular that we would change over here, but we're still mixing them together very nicely, making sure that everything blends together in the correct way and that we're not cooling down anything or darkening anything here that's already been warmed up or affected here. We're basically taking all the information from node 4 and doing our adjustments here, blending them together, and then feeding them into the final output. So not that this turned out as a great, what a sentence to say, but this is kind of like the basic structure of the nodes and how they work together. And I hope that gave you a basic understanding of how it works and why it's so great. If you have any questions or any thoughts on this video and notes in general and why you should use them, why you shouldn't use them, all that kind of stuff, leave the comments down below and I'll be happy to answer them, maybe make another video if this wasn't comprehensive enough. I see that this is already around 30 minutes, so I'll stop it here. And I really hope that it helped you, because the nodes was my biggest fear when I walked into Davinci for the first time. And it kind of seemed a little bit overwhelming, but understanding it on a basic level and starting to work with it and starting to split everything that you do into new nodes makes it very easy to go back and see what you've been doing earlier and then correcting small things and adjusting along the way, rather than going into something like a lumetri scope or a lumetri color, or going into just one node and trying to figure out what was this small dial, and you can't really see the difference of what you're doing, because when you're turning it off and turning it on again, it's turning off everything and turning on everything. And then you have to maybe just remove it completely and turn it on again with Command C, but that's not really a viable option as well, isn't it? So thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way through, remember to click the subscribe button and like this video if you liked it. That really helps out my channel a lot and helps me bring a lot more videos to you guys. So we're on a streak right now, creating a lot of videos here in December. So I'll probably see you tomorrow as well if you follow along. And no matter what, take care and have a great day.